security at the regional, global, and national level. Please, Carol.
Thank you, Ugne. Thank you, everybody, for showing up at this late. I know we're tired and a bit sleepy, but we're still here discussing this issue, which is definitely one of the most important in the pact. Without peace, without peaceful societies and justice, there cannot be sustainable development, there cannot be human rights, and there cannot be an international system to support cooperation among member states, and of course, with the inclusion of civil society. As some of you may know, this process of the Pact of the Future has been going on for 18 months. Yesterday, we finally were able to have the adoption of the Pact of the Future after several consultations, not only among member states, but also with civil society, thanks to the facilitation of Namibia and Germany. There were at least 3 consultations that took place in the last couple months to hear and provide inputs from civil society. And at the end of the day, we have 56 actions that are part of the Pact of the Future. And across those 56 actions, we have 13 mentions of civil society, which is quite shocking despite having had a conference about it last May in Nairobi, and of course, all of the different inputs that the sector provided. Out of those 56 actions, we have a second section of the Pact of the Future that relates to peace and security. There are 15 actions under the Pact of the Future that are addressing different issues. For example, and I have them right here, Action 13, redouble efforts to build and sustain peaceful, inclusive, and just societies. They are also addressing protection of civilians in armed conflict, ensuring their humanitarian response that countries need to abide to protect civilians that are the crossfire. That includes, of course, and we see attacks to journalists, to the UN personnel, and particularly in the last year, we see that this has been the highest number of UN personnel killed in our conflict. We also have some reference to how member states need to diffuse tensions to seek pacific settlement of disputes to diplomacy and dialogue. There are other points with regards to their obligation to abide to International Court of Justice mandates. And they're also talking about accountability. But it's surprising that even though they're mentioning the International Court of Justice role, there's no mention of the International Criminal Court, for example. There's no reference about what happens when those criminals, which sometimes are part of governments themselves, are not being judged or adequately being brought to justice mechanisms. And will be interesting in the last couple of days as we will see some of those war criminals showing up in their suits here in New York, just with all impunity being being able to address other member states who, when you read the pact actually, and when you go across these 15 actions, you are able to see that the pact is speaking of what particularly has been happening in the last 12 months. As we witness, and I don't have to go into the details, but you know that the unprecedented breaches to international humanitarian law, to international human rights law, and to international law overall, particularly in the Middle East. Just in the last 24 hours, we have hundreds of recorded deaths due to bombardments in Lebanon, but we also see an unprecedented man-made humanitarian catastrophe in Sudan, with 2 warring parties are unable to stop and sit down to prevent from the country to collapsing even further. So even though that there are mentions to accountability, when it comes to actual procedures, when it comes to actual compliance to international treaties, to ratification of international treaties, that is completely absent. So it's honestly, when reading this, and as someone who has worked in this sector, including 2 special political missions of the United Nations, I can see the flaws in that regard. There's still no intention, real intention for member states to abide by international humanitarian law, especially, and I have to say it, when we're witnessing a genocide. What is happening in Gaza it's a genocide. What is happening there are war crimes. What is happening there are breaches to international law and attacks to the United Nations that we never seen before. More than 400 schools have been bombed. United Nations UNRWA schools. Accusations unfunded and lack of evidence when it comes to accusing those who are committing those acts. There are other points that address how to pursue a future free of terrorism, even though that they do not reflect on the roots of terrorism or why terrorism happens. What are the dynamics behind that? And one that's quite alarming as well, across the 15 points. And with that, I think I finished my 5 minutes. But it's the reflection around that nuclear war after decades. It's coming back to the language of United Nations processes due to the escalations in the Russia-Ukraine war. So I would summarize that despite the negotiations, despite the inclusion of civil society in these different consultations, having had a conference, we still lack a real responsibility and commitments towards international justice and ending impunity when, as never before in the last 8 decades, we're seeing human rights violations that are extremely concerning. So please have a look at that section. Is the second section of the pact, and it's upon us to continue to ask member states to follow up with this at the national level specifically. So thank you.
Thank you, Carol, so much for giving us that overview of this segment of the Pact of the Future and highlighting those implications that are there. Moving forward, I would like to introduce Kavita Desai from UN Representative for Quaker United Nations Office. And the question for you, Kavita, would be, in what ways can we as a civil society engage in the follow-up to the actions named within the Pact of the Future? And of course, SDG 16 too. Please.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I think that Carol did a really good job of just laying out the very bleak political situation that we find ourselves in. And this comes back to the important role that civil society has to play in just making any progress. I think that we're all here because we all believe in SDG 16 and the promise that's within the targets that are set. And we didn't get much in the pact, and the actions are voluntary anyway. So where should we all be thinking about focusing our energy? First priority is holding our own governments accountable. We have language around ICJ. We have language around, protection. What we're seeing the opposite in terms of what we're all living. There is shrinking civic space. There is a lack of funding. There, are challenges around human rights everywhere. So we have to keep pushing our own governments to be accountable and also build coalitions like this. These spaces are really important for us to be able to connect with our peers and see what's working, what's not working, where can we share and learn and potentially partner. And there are a lot of UN processes that are coming up. It's really unclear what's going to happen with the pact in terms of any types of monitoring and accountability. So my suggestions are a little bit more issue focused. So it depends on what actually you're working on. So I'm going to go through kind of a calendar of events, and hopefully that will be useful to you all. So where are there goal 16 or 16 plus issues that are coming up, and where is there space to potentially have some movement and some momentum built around these issues around peace and development? So the first one early November, no, the first week of November, the 4th to the 8th, is the UN Habitat Conference. So this is habitats, cities and human settlements. So it's basically essentially where we all live. And there's a lot of language in that space, in that conference, and the previous outcome document around local governance. And we all know that all politics are local. So what happens in terms of local regulations has a huge impact all the way up to the international level. So that's a space that is actually relatively open and welcoming to civil society, and where there is good language that then needs to be translated into something that's actionable. So if you're working at a local level, I would suggest really looking at UN Habitat. It's happening in Cairo, and I believe registration is still open. In terms of an emergent issue, we have the Internet Governance Forum that will take place in December. The digital space, artificial intelligence, these are all things that could have a positive impact and create space for peace building or for positive peace, or could also swing the other way and have and create spaces for that are violent. So it's incumbent on people that are working in around peace and development to also be aware of the issues that are already happening and how you can impact that. So that's for the rest of this year. Very quickly looking through next year, financing. Everything happens with money. That's just the reality of the world. So there is going to be a big discussion that will lead up to a Financing for Development conference in June. Goal 16 comes under the SDGs. The SDGs are, how are we financing this work? We know that work around peace building, prevention, all of these things are underfunded. So, and organizations that are doing that type of work are getting grants that are cut. As we see conflicts rising, military budgets rising exponentially, where's that money coming from? It's coming out of all of the work that would build peace from a grassroots level. So it's really important that there is something concrete that we get out of the financing for development process, and that there's some tie-in to this big discussion that was had at the UN a few years ago around financing for peace building. So how does that actually connect with the people that are doing the work? So that's an important one to look at. We have a whole process that has already kicked off around the peace building architecture review, and that's going to review the entire peace pillar of the UN. Some of that has already started. There will be a Secretary General report that comes out, but there will be a whole negotiated process that happens next year. This is a big opportunity to strengthen the connections between the development SDG space and also the more traditional peace building space. And again, like, how is this delivering? How is the UN delivering for the people that it's supposed to be delivering for? Is it doing it effectively? Is it just being blocked by big power politics? Like, what actually would be helpful to the people that are on the receiving end of some of this? There are big anniversaries around the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, 25 years, Youth, Peace and Security, 10 years. Again, these moments of anniversaries are periods where we can reflect and say, like, is this working the way that we want it to? And what should we be changing to try and help it work better? World Social Summit is also happening, and peace issues are not siloed, they cut across everything. So that would also be an opportunity. And then we have the High Level Political Forum. It's every July. This coming July is that I'm going to assume that that's telling me my time is coming to a close anyway. That's okay. We have the goal on health that's going to be reviewed, the goal on gender, decent work and economic growth, and life before water, life below water. So these are also things that are all connected to peace. So it's not just SDG 16 when it's a review year. It's also, how does health come into play? We're seeing more and more people that are not having access to health care, whether it's people in Gaza that are being intentionally deprived, people in Ukraine, people in Sudan, whatever the issue is, people in this country that are, dealing with regulations that are limiting their access to healthcare. So, or also like the quality of our marine habitats, that also is connected to health and to peace and people's livelihoods. So these are also spaces to just reinforce that connection and how this goes back to impacting people's lives. There's a process around enhanced participation of Indigenous peoples at the UN. We have the election of the new Secretary General. There's international financial institutions reforms. So there are lots of potential opportunities where civil society can really make an impact and just reinforce, one, the importance of civil society, the fact that civil society are first responders in almost every scenario and are delivering for development on the ground, and that we have to keep pushing to hold our own governments accountable.
Thank you, Kavita, for your insights and such a detailed introduction on the events and momentums where we as a civil society can engage in upcoming years. Moving forward, I would like to present my dear colleague Elena Marma from engagement officer from Transparency, Accountability and Participation Network. And Alana, could you please a bit elaborate what actually we as a civil society could do at a global level? Also share your experience from your network, what you have been doing already in relation with the SDG 16.
Great, thank you, Agne. And thanks everyone for sticking with us late in the evening of what has been already a long day, a long week, it feels like, although it is Monday. But yeah, I want to share a little bit about the TAP network, Transparency, Accountability, and Participation Network. And we as a network are comprised of over 500 civil society organizations around the world working to build more peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. So folks working on SDG 16 in some way, shape, or form. And broadly looking at accountability to the 2030 agenda as well. And I think with the sort of bleak state of the world that we've named, specifically around rising conflict, inequalities, violence, we as the TAP network were really motivated to think about how can we mobilize civil society in a way that is really meaningful and inclusive to really start to call for urgent action on these issues. And so we started something called the SDG 16 Now campaign. I think I dropped off some postcards about that and some stickers because folks love stickers. I know I do. In the back, but we are as a campaign all united by the fact that we're working on SDG 16. We have colleagues from around the world. Some of my colleagues up here with me today are also co-leads on some of the thematic clusters of the campaign. And I think something that's really worth noting in terms of how we've been approaching our work is that over the last year, we sort of started a process of consultation really at the Nairobi conference in May with an in-person workshop. And we held a series of consultations and started to question what are, beyond the super nerdy, geeky targets of SDG 16, what are the issues at the heart of SDG 16? How can we kind of distill that into language that is a bit more accessible to folks? And so we have 5 thematic clusters on peace, justice and rule of law, inclusion, civic space, and human rights, institutions and accountability, and interlinkages and financing, to sort of Kavita's point that nothing really happens without money, right? But also that we need to be thinking about how does SDG 16 and these issues of peace, justice, inclusion, institutions, how do these relate to other issues that are quite important? So how do we bring in the feminist movement, the youth movement, the climate movement, et cetera? And I think this sort of strategy of shifting to get ourselves out of the targets and the jargon of SDG 16 to a more thematically rooted exploration, we were really able to start to unpack what we call like big ticket issues. So things that are maybe a little bit controversial, but issues that are really roadblocks to progress on SDG 16 or on these issues. What are some of the transformative changes that we want to see in our society? And so these are things like, if you visit our website, you'll see all of our thematic priorities, but we've identified priorities around reducing military expenditure and increasing investment in local peace builders and local civil society generally. These are some overarching kind of objectives that we have for the campaign. And I think this was something that we already moved into prior to the Pact for the Future being negotiated. But I think as we look beyond the Pact for the Future, what we will really be identifying is kind of like what is missing. To Carol's point, I think she really articulately identified what's missing. What are some of these really big challenges that we're facing around a lack of accountability to international laws and norms and things of that nature, the increased military expenditure, like I mentioned. What are these really big ticket concerns that we have that we know we won't be able to achieve progress on our work without addressing those first? And how can we, as the SDG 16 Now campaign, really place those at the forefront of our messaging, of our priorities, and really mobilize folks behind these these really urgent priorities. And sort of like there are, of course, some hooks within the document itself. And I think Kavita really clearly outlined some really upcoming opportunities. But I think we also should be asking ourselves this question of, what is missing, and how can we find ways to really mobilize around that as civil society. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Alana, and thanks for the work that you do with your network and the wonderful campaigns that you organize that I believe quite many of us are part. So thanks again. And then moving forward, I would like to present Bahia Ghati from she is a regional coordinator of American United Network of Young Peace Builders. And Bahia, Alana just mentioned, that there are some gaps in the Pact of the Future, and especially the chapter on peace and security. And in the relation with your work that you do at the regional level, could you name those gaps? And what do you think is waiting for you in the upcoming years while implementing, and monitoring all those things that are mentioned in the pact? Thanks.
Thank you so much. So first, to echo what my colleague said in the beginning, we just received the news today about Lebanon, and we have some colleagues at the UNOY network who are being bombed right now. So I wanted to start by saying that it's a little bit frustrating. I don't want to be too negative, but today it hit me hard. I felt like we are here playing the show and giving speeches and listening to speeches, and at the same time, we know what's happening around the world in different areas that are very affected by several crises. So my heart right now is with them, with the other affected areas. But on a more positive note, I'll try to bring some examples, like specific examples. Especially my area of expertise would be the financial that we were mentioning very much because it's very important. So as we all know, the Pact of the Future is definitely a crucial framework for civil society engagement in promoting sustainable peace, but also in addressing the multifaceted crisis that I have just mentioned. So UNOY, as a very brief explanation, we are the United Network of Young Peace Builders. We are in every continent and region, but I'm the regional coordinator of Americas, which is a very diverse continent. So you can imagine that it's a challenging task to do that daily. So by my experience at UNOY, that it's formed by youth-led organizations around the world, I have seen the power that young people have in transforming and achieving that sustainable peace that we want to achieve. So they are definitely not passive, and they are very proactive. So the pact does have some flaws, as we know, but let's agree, like never that we are ever gonna produce it's gonna be perfect. So maybe on a more positive note, we can assume that like we are always going to be criticizing and trying to do better, which is a good thing because it means that we are always going to be working more. So some key factors that I think that can be included for the accountability and the implementation, that it's probably our responsibility because sometimes we complain about like, oh, who brought the pact or the governments or the officials. Well, we can also do our part trying to implement it and held accountability, as my colleague said before. So kind of 5 points that I wanted to bring to the table were first, empower youth leadership. That I know it sounds cliche, but I will give specific examples. So the financial part, as we said, it's essential. There are two initiatives that have been like launched kind of recently, and I'm part of both. One of them is the EU Youth Empowerment Fund. It's a pilot initiative of 10 million euros that it has been launched like probably a few months ago, and then the Youth Advisory Council of Comic Relief, which is also a fund that is called Juntanza Fund. and they give grants both to youth-led organizations. And the good part is that we, young people, are choosing who those grants go for. So we are in we are in the table, we are making the decisions, and we are part of the governance, and we do the guidelines, the selection process, and then the following up of those grants. So those are two good examples of how financial opportunities are becoming more available for young people. And the good, also a positive factor is that it's not only for formal organizations, but also informal and individuals, which we know for young people, it's always very like a big barrier, the legal access. And not every one of us is a founder, but I also applaud the founders, but it's a very difficult task. So it's great to see two big organizations like the EU and Comic Relief bringing those opportunities and choosing. In the Youth Advisory Council, we are 8 young people from only up to 25, so very young. And most of us are from the Global South. I'm from Argentina, by the way. I never mentioned very south, very, very south in the map. So second point will be leveraging the digital platforms. As we know, it's part of our reality. IA, as much as we can demonize it, we always use it probably daily. And some good examples that I can bring is, of course, TikTok. On amplifying those stories that resonate with our experiences. A very like short story, and maybe it's a fun one. Last time I was speaking at the EcoSoc Youth Forum, I uploaded my speech and it was not so viral, but I also uploaded the backstage and when I was preparing the bathroom of the UN because I was late to my like speaking opportunity, and that went much more viral because people want to know what's the backstage, what are you going to talk about, but not the prepared speech like formal structure and everything. So that means that we have to be transparent and very like honest about what we share and what our reality is, because we are not the person that is reading a speech on a 5 minutes very prepared stage. We are the person who is preparing the backstage and running late in the bathroom. Also very showing the emotions, the storytelling. Those are kind of like essential things to engage and to get the motivation for other change makers to act. And a good example that I can bring from South America, America, is El Milenio from Honduras. They are working on democracy, like digital advocacy on the democracy aspect, but not only national debates and campaigns for government, but also very local, like congressmen, congresswomen that we usually never know, even adults. They don't know what they propose. We only know the 2 or 3 biggest candidates, even if we're in the political scope. So I think it's a great job. They do it amazingly. Giselle Wolosny is one of the leaders. Yeah, I just wanted to give them credits, and that's a specific example. Then on the third point, cross-sector collaborations. OACNO from Argentina, I have been a volunteer there for 7 years. It's a very good example on how you can collaborate with governments, private sector, other NGOs. And it's an organization that has 500 people working as volunteers in 8 provinces. They implement, I don't know, probably more than 30 projects a year, and most of them are below 25. And they are incredibly efficient, professional. They have a work ethics. So it's a way to show that young people can actually have those leadership positions. I was an executive director at the age of 20, and I had a big group of 150 people under my supervision, which was a great responsibility. But at the same time, if I was in a company and in this private sector, I would have never gotten there at that age. And that's because the system doesn't allow it. So if we can switch that focus, maybe include young people in boards, probably a lot of people here are part of different boards. Try to get at least one young people to the table so we can bring a fresh perspective, especially in SDG 16, that it's very much needed. And then number 4, inclusive resource allocation. So in those granting processes that we are trying to change and switch the focus, of course, we're trying to address barriers to participation, marginalized communities. And for that, it's also important to have them like design and in the governance of those activities. And lastly, fostering intergenerational dialogue, which we know it's essential. But today it happened to me. I went to an event in the morning. I was also a speaker. um, for comic relief that I was just telling you about. Um, they were all very much invested in youth participation, but I felt like we needed to be more young people in the event. It was amazing. They really allowed me to tell them everything I could about how to engage with us from my perspective. That I also, at the same time, just last comment, I want to acknowledge that it's a privileged one, because right now I'm living in New York. I have been lucky enough to have several scholarships in my life that have allowed me to come here and to be here speaking to you today, even the barrier language. I have learned English since I was very young, and I know it's not the case for everyone, and not everyone can actually be here today and speaking. So it's a very fine, thin line up to how much we can, like how much weight under our shoulders can we have, and how many youth are we representing, even if we're youth. Like even if I'm from the global south, I'm a woman, I'm Latina, and a lot of factors that make me maybe not of the majority. There are other privileges that I have inside those. Even when they ask me how it feels to be an immigrant in the US, I know I have a very privileged situation. So I just want to address that. Remember, like, reminder to all of us that being here today is a very, very privilege. And yeah, I think we can all work together to address the gaps that the Pact of the Future has. But maybe only 5 minutes are not enough to say them all. But as my colleague said, we can read the pact and work on our level, especially local, that it's what works best.
Thank you so much, Bahia, for those 5 points that you just mentioned, and also for sharing your personal and organizational experience in relation with the work that you do. Thanks a lot. And moving to our last panelist, I would like to present to you Mahisola Kinsane from Women for Peace and Gender Equality Initiative from Nigeria. And I would like to ask Sola, how do you think? One. Okay. Excuse me for the technical issues. So my question would be, at national one. Okay. One. Okay. It seems that okay. So my question again. So at the national level, how will the Pact of the Future would impact your work? And of course, what kind of opportunities you see within the framework of the Pact? And what kind of good experiences, good practices you could share with us, what you have been doing already at the national level in terms of peace and security? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Working in Nigeria is a big space, and a lot of happened in the last 4 to 6 years in terms of after COVID. We went to Naira crisis, from Naira crisis to food crisis, from food crisis to subsidy removal. But the resilience of Nigeria is very, very, high. And it's always amazed me how people can, come out from that, and we keep on going and going. But then in our work in the organization, we cut across so many issues concerning women, especially violence against women. We're able to, we did run for that policy to come to life for almost 80 years. Before all the 36 states in Nigeria were able to um, make sure they have it in their state. But of recent, we have a pushback. We are the Senate, they want to remove the law that is protecting women against violence. But because of that partnership and coalition we've been doing, women rally around, and we went straight to the House of Assembly to make sure that no, you cannot remove this. If we cannot participate in politics because of the low percentage of women there, then one law that protects us, that we are still fighting in all the states, you want to remove, this is not acceptable. But thank God we are still on it, but we are getting there. That make sure that, well, because of that coalition partnership that we have been taught due to SDG, that's a good success story for us. That no matter our differences because of the diversity in Nigeria, when we have an issue that is, that is common to everybody, we pull down our differences and make sure we push forward. And that is a strong one for Nigerian women. And secondly, by the time the intergenerational discourse that she talked about, we bring about young women to be part of this collaboration partnership. Along the line, we did a lot of research to know what is happening in your context, in your state, what is happening. Then I saw something that was so scary to me right in my own state, that we have irregular migration where we have thousands of women, sent back to Nigeria, and they have been molested, they have been, I don't know how to use the word, so traumatizing, because they want to get, good job, decent work, and they will go through irregular migration through Kano, northern Nigeria to Libya, and many of them died along the way. But because we didn't even know, nobody talks about it, but because we are able to do that research, we can see that a lot of them are dying. Thousands are dying. So we have to do a big strategic advocacy to government, and they have to talk to government of Libya. They have to involve IOM to make sure that many of them that are ready to come home, they were able to come back safely. But we didn't even stop there. By the time they are coming back home, we start to rally around among them to give them psychosocial support, to give them a lot of health issues among them, to make sure they come out with a good health outcome. But then the pact of the future now, how is it going to work for us? We continue to push for progress, because one gap I can see clearly is that there is a lot they have to do from the bottom up approach, which was not in that policy. And it's really weakening my mind when I read through that. Why a lot is happening at the grassroots level, and there is no way we can bring local action to global action if we don't let it start from them. So there's a lot we are going to do, and we continue like the way she engaged. I've learned a lot from that. There's a lot where we can engage and continue to push for progress to make sure that all these things, we bring it back to the local setting. But then the space in Nigeria too, civil society is shrinking. But then we didn't relent. We make sure that we bring together, coordinate ourselves together. Coordination is one thing we learn a lot from UN Women in Nigeria this year too, because they came in and said, you are doing fantastically well, but there is no coordination. So we have to stop doing things in silos. Let's coordinate. Let's have a dashboard to report everything you are doing and document everything. So we can have evidence-based advocacy to government to see that this is where the problem is, especially in women, peace and security. And then we are pushing for that table to be there. In terms of peace and security, it is still very hard line in Nigeria for women to talk when they want to talk about terrorism or conflict or things that bother women that do a trade between borders in the Republic of Benin, Togo, and all that. There are so many violence happening in terms of using their body to negotiate for their trades to come through the border. So, they have to, pay with their body. So there's a lot going on in that conversation too. But we continue to, organize together and make sure we push for progress. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for sharing your experience from Nigeria, and for highlighting also the importance of the partnerships. I think that's what all of us need to seek in upcoming years in the framework of the Pact of the Future. And I would like to thank my fellow panelists for your insights. And we would like to move to the second part of our session. And here around the room, there are several stations. We have 6 stations with a big flip chart papers around. And I would like to ask every one of you to contribute to this workshop. So there are 6 questions, and how we will do that. So at first, of course, you will need to stand up to move a bit, because all day you have been sitting. So now it's also exercise, but for now, just a minute, sit and listen the instructions, and then you can stand up. So a small exercise also going around the room. So we will have 6 groups. Group number 1 will be here. Group number 2 on the wall here. There is a paper with the number 3, 4, 5 from this side, and number 6 here on the table. So now what I would like to ask you to do, to go to the paper that is closest to you. So 6, the people in the middle go to number 5, the people from here goes to number 4, part of the people from this side and this side goes to number 3. We start, you stand up and you start to go. And then part of the people goes to number 2. And then we have some people also here at number 1. And I also would encourage the panelists to join the groups. Okay? So number 1, I will tell you, please divide yourself into the groups. I would like to see people standing around the posters. I will tell. Just a second. So can I see people around the posters, just to be sure that we have someone at each of the posters?